Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. This time, we're going to be exploring the life and legacy of, well, I'm sure you know from the title, Mahatma Gandhi. But, when you think about it, how did this guy, Mohandas Gandhi, this, seemingly regular person, become such a huge, influential figure? That's what we're going to be looking at today. And we'll be using The Story of Gandhi by Rajkumari Shankar to guide us along the way.
Yeah, and it's a pretty amazing journey. One thing that a lot of people don't realize is that Gandhi's philosophy wasn't something he just like came up with all at once. It kind of changed and grew over time through all the stuff he went through, the struggles and even his mistakes. And understanding how that all happened is, I think, really important if you want to get like the real power of his ideas.
So let's go all the way back to the beginning. What really stuck out to you about Gandhi's early life back in Porbandar? We're talking like childhood here, way before he became Mahatma.
Well, even when he was really young, you could already kind of see some of the things that would make him who he was. Like the book talks about how these stories, like the one about Shravana, carrying his blind parents on a pilgrimage, it really seemed to like affect him deeply. It sparked this sense of like duty and putting others first, and you see that kind of thing pop up again and again throughout his life.
It's almost like the beginning of his social conscience. But I mean, he wasn't like some perfect kid, right? He had his own like moral struggles, right?
Oh, for sure. He tried eating meat, even did some petty theft as a teenager, things that went against his family's, beliefs. But what's really interesting is how much guilt he felt. Like he was constantly battling with his own conscience. It shows you just how deep his commitment to truth was, and that later became like a fundamental part of all his beliefs.
That's super interesting because we often think of Gandhi as like this complete icon, but he was just like constantly working on himself, refining his ideas. And speaking of refining, his time studying law in England seems like a pretty big turning point. He's trying to fit in, even picks up some Western habits, but then ends up going back to his roots. What was going on there, do you think?
It was a time of like a lot of self-discovery. He was learning new things, seeing new ways of life, but he also ran into prejudice. And I think he realized that real freedom came from being himself, not trying to be what other people expected. That choice to go back to his roots, that was huge. It kind of sets the stage for him becoming the leader we all know.
And then, of course, there's South Africa. It seems like that's where his activism really starts to take shape.
Oh, totally. Gandhi goes to South Africa thinking he's going to practice law, but he gets hit with the harsh reality of racial discrimination. Imagine like being thrown off a train, kicked out of your first class seat just because of the color of your skin. That kind of stuff. The everyday humiliation. That's what really ignited his fight for justice.
Yeah, the book really makes you feel that casual racism he had to deal with, like that time when a magistrate tells him to take off his turban in court. It's a pretty stark reminder of like the prejudice back then.
Exactly. And it wasn't just a one-time thing. It was like built into the system.
Mhm.
The Black Act, for example, basically made it a crime to be Indian in South Africa. And this is where satyagraha comes in, his philosophy of nonviolent resistance. It starts to grow from this.
So satyagraha comes out of this struggle against injustice.
Yeah.
Can you explain that a bit more? What makes it different from just like protesting or resisting?
That's a good question because satyagraha is way more than just saying no.
Yeah.
It's about going up against injustice with like serious moral strength, refusing to play along with a system that's oppressing you, but doing it without using violence. It takes incredible discipline, self-control, and a really deep commitment to truth, which Gandhi believed was the most powerful weapon against injustice.
So it's not about winning a physical fight, but more like a moral one, right? It's about showing the oppressor they're wrong by like staying true to your own commitment to truth and nonviolence. And he really puts this into action, doesn't he? Organizing protests, getting thrown in jail, even getting attacked, but never giving up.
Exactly. And it's not just about what one person does. He understands that there's power in numbers.
Yeah.
The Natal Indian Congress, which he helped start, becomes this way to challenge those discriminatory laws. And then there's Tolstoy Farm, this really interesting experiment in communal living.
Yeah, Tolstoy Farm seems like more than just a protest camp. It's almost like he's trying to create like a model society based on his principles.
Yeah. You got it. Tolstoy Farm was about being self-sufficient, about rejecting all the material stuff of the system he was fighting. It was like a living example of his ideals. A little glimpse of the India he dreamed of, free from British rule, but also free from all the internal divisions and problems.
So by 1914, when he leaves South Africa, Gandhi's not just a lawyer anymore. He's a like a seasoned activist, a leader with a strong philosophy that he developed through years of struggle.
And he's about to go back to India, bringing satyagraha with him to a country that's on the verge of some major change. But that's a story for the next part of our deep dive. So Gandhi comes back to India, and it's not like, a big welcome party or anything. He just jumps right back into more struggles.
Right.
His first big campaign there, the Champaran Satyagraha, it really shows you something important about how he worked. He didn't just, show up and start protesting. He spent, months carefully looking into everything, getting all the facts, and really listening to those indigo farmers who were being taken advantage of by, the British planters.
So it's like he was building a case, like a lawyer, but instead of going to court, his tools were truth and nonviolent action.
Exactly. And you know what? It worked really well. By showing everyone how unjust things were in such detail, he forced the British to, admit there was a problem, and that eventually led to changes that helped those farmers.
It seems like that kind of sets the pattern for a lot of his campaigns, right?
Oh.
Whether it was the mill workers in Ahmedabad or the peasants in Kedah during that famine, he's always standing up for those who are being oppressed and using satyagraha to make their voices heard and challenge the system.
And it's amazing how he could, adapt satyagraha to fit each situation. Like the Ahmedabad mill strike, that involved a really powerful act of, self-sacrifice that put a lot of pressure on the mill owners to negotiate. And in Kedah, it was about everyone refusing to pay taxes, a direct challenge to the British, but again, done completely non-violently.
So he's racking up these early wins, and it really makes him a leader. But then comes the Rollout Act in 1919, and things get really bad. Can you remind us what that act was all about and how it affected the movement?
Well, the Rollout Act was basically this set of laws that gave the British government a ton of power. Like, they could arrest people and lock them up without a trial, all in the name of, keeping things quiet. It was a direct attack on people's basic freedoms, and it made a lot of people in India really angry.
And that anger leads to the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, right? The book describes it so vividly, it's chilling. General Dyer ordering his troops to fire on all those unarmed people who were trapped in that garden is a horrific example of, colonial brutality.
The Jallianwala Bagh massacre changed everything. It showed the limits of nonviolence when you're up against that kind of force, and it hit Gandhi hard. He actually stopped the Satyagraha movement because he knew people were so angry they weren't ready for disciplined nonviolence.
So it was always just about tactics, right? He was always paying attention to the situation, how ready the people were, and changing his approach.
Absolutely. He knew uncontrolled anger could be just as bad as the violence of the oppressor. That time of reflection was crucial because it's when he really refines satyagraha. He emphasizes how important self-discipline and mental strength are, not just as tactics, but as basic principles. He realized that true strength isn't about physical power. It's about sticking to truth and nonviolence, even when things are incredibly brutal.
And this leads us to probably his most famous campaign, the Salt Satyagraha. For anyone listening who might not know, can you explain why salt became such a powerful symbol of resistance?
Salt, right. Everyone needs it. Rich or poor, it's like a basic necessity. But the British put a tax on it. So basically they were taxing just existing as an Indian person. Gandhi saw how powerful that was as a symbol, By going after the salt tax, he could unite Indians from all walks of life.
So it wasn't really about the salt itself, but about what it represented, the British control over the most basic things people needed.
You got it. And that salt march to Dandi, where he walked for 24 days to make salt from seawater, it was brilliant. It was symbolic and strategic, and it got the world's attention, made Gandhi a global figure.
And those pictures, those peaceful protesters getting beaten by the British police at Darasana, those went everywhere, didn't they? Talk about a David and Goliath situation, only this time David's weapon isn't a slingshot, it's the moral high ground.
Yeah, the whole world was shocked by how brutal the British were. It totally backfired on them, just showed everyone how oppressive they were, and actually made more people support Gandhi and the movement.
So all that pressure finally forces the British to negotiate, leading to the Gandhi-Irwin Pact in 1931. It wasn't full independence, but it was a big win, wasn't it?
Definitely. The pact got political prisoners released and set the stage for the Round Table Conference in London. Gandhi went there in his simple clothes representing the Indian National Congress and demanded complete independence.
It's kind of amazing to think about him, this regular guy from India, sitting there with all those powerful British people and demanding freedom for his people. It shows you how strong his beliefs were.
But in the end, the Round Table Conference didn't give India much. The British, especially Winston Churchill, didn't want to let go of India, Gandhi went back home, disappointed but still determined. He knew the fight wasn't over and that things were going to get even harder.
So Gandhi goes back to India, and the British are still resisting, and it feels like the fight for independence is getting even more intense. What were some of the big problems he had to deal with during this time?
Well, one thing was that the British went back to their old tricks, arresting people, censoring stuff, trying to shut down the movement. And Gandhi ended up in jail again. But this time, things took a weird turn with this idea of separate electorates for the untouchables.
And this really bothered Gandhi, right? He saw it as this way to divide Indian society and keep the caste system going, a system he'd been fighting against forever.
Exactly. And how did he respond? Classic Gandhi, a fast unto death. It was a huge step. Even some of his closest people were like, whoa, is this really necessary? But Gandhi wasn't backing down. He was willing to die to protect the idea of unity and equality.
It's hard to imagine a leader today doing something that extreme,
Yeah.
but it really shows you how much he believed in what he was fighting for and how much moral authority he had.
Yeah, it made a huge impact. It got the whole country fired up and forced the people in charge to come to the table. And they ended up with the Pune Pact, which gave the untouchables representation but kept the electorate together. It proved how powerful Gandhi's unwavering stance was and his commitment to nonviolence.
It's another win for satyagraha. But the fight for independence kept going. In the mid-1930s, Gandhi shifted gears a bit, focusing more on social reform and spiritual growth. He set up his new headquarters at Sevagram, this simple village community. It seems kind of like he was stepping back from politics, but was he really?
No, not really. This was actually super important. Gandhi knew that real independence wouldn't just come from kicking out the British. It meant building a society based on justice, equality, and people taking care of themselves. Sevagram was like a model for that vision, where people lived simply, worked together, and practiced nonviolence every day.
Then, of course, World War II breaks out in 1939 and throws everything into chaos. And India gets pulled into another war that wasn't their choice. How did Gandhi handle that mess?
It was a tough situation. Gandhi was totally against the violence of war, but he also knew that fascism had to be stopped. He encouraged people to do individual satyagraha, protesting specific British policies that he thought were wrong. And at the same time, he told Indians to get ready to rule themselves, because he knew the war was going to weaken the British Empire.
So even with all that going on, he was still thinking about the long term, that ultimate goal of an independent and self-reliant India.
Right. And when the war ended in 1945, the push for independence got even stronger. The British were weaker, but they still wanted to hold on to their empire, so they sent the cabinet mission to India to try and work out a deal for independence. The hope was for a unified India, but, after decades of the British playing divide and conquer, tensions between Hindus and Muslims were really high.
And it's tragic because Gandhi spent his whole life promoting Hindu-Muslim unity, but the dream of a single nation fell apart. Partition, dividing India into two separate countries, became a reality in 1947.
It was a really sad time for Gandhi. He saw it as like a failure of everything he'd worked for, but even with all the violence and people being displaced because of partition, he kept preaching peace and asking people to forgive each other. He went to places where riots were happening, risking his own life to try and stop the hate.
It's amazing, that commitment to nonviolence, even in the middle of such a terrible situation.
I know, it's inspiring. But tragically, just a few months after independence, on January 30th, 1948, Gandhi was assassinated by a Hindu nationalist. He was killed because this guy thought Gandhi was in the way of creating a Hindu-dominated India. It was a huge loss, but his legacy continued.
Gandhi's story shows how much power one person can have to challenge an empire, inspire millions, and change the course of history. His life was full of ups and downs, unwavering beliefs, and constant self-reflection.
And maybe his greatest legacy is the power of satyagraha, which lives on. That idea of nonviolent resistance still inspires people fighting for social justice everywhere, It reminds us that even when things seem impossible, truth, nonviolence, and standing up for what's right can really change the world.
As we finish up our deep dive into Gandhi's life, I think the question for all of us is, where do you see chances to practice nonviolence and truth in your own life? How can Gandhi's example help you face problems with courage and compassion, and maybe, just maybe, make the world a little bit better one step at a time?
That's a really good question. And Gandhi's story reminds us that we can all be part of making things better, no matter how small our actions might seem. Like the journey of 1,000 miles starts with one step, and every act of kindness, every time we stand up against injustice, it all helps to build a more just and compassionate world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the amazing life and legacy of Mahatma Gandhi. We hope you learned some new things and maybe even feel a little inspired to use his teachings in your own life.